I think that, like, in thinking about Haidt's work in particular, th- I don't even disagree with his solution. I just think that it's a partial solution to a far more complicated problem than he wants to describe. And I think, like, there's a great quote in this New York Times article about Jonathan Haidt's new work that from, I think, Dan Dresner, and he's like, the ideas industry, which is the name of his book, the ideas industry, is like all about the one thing you need to know, and then here's the solutions section, and like the one thing you need to know is a thing you need to know, not all the things you need to know, and the
Right.
solution section is almost always really kind of pat
Right.
and simultaneously too simple and impossible to implement. And so,
Yeah.
like, I want to just sort of give some credence to the feeling that, that like, I think there are a few things that are present in both of their work, though I think Twenge, because she's more specifically writing about generations, gets to it more directly, which is this, like, you know, the generational shoulders are getting narrower because technology is changing faster. And I'm like, yeah, but then you're like picking and choosing when we're going to do things that are based on like birth rates and major
Right.
events. I think the other thing that happens is like muddling up different kinds of generational struggles. Like a world war simply is different than climate change.
Yeah.
It's like a world war is a finite thing. You know who the enemy is, you know where to send your troops,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
And but climate change is really complicated. You can't just sort of say, well, why aren't they banding together in solidarity? And it's like, well, to fight what?
Right.
Like, which thing are we fighting? And I
Yeah.
think, like, right now all the fights feel this way about democracy stuff. I feel this way about climate change. I feel this way about disinformation and social cohesion. Like, they are problems that just start to, like, you can't hold on to them. They just fall through your fingers every time you try to grab onto them. And
Yeah.
these solutions are just too easy. And they don't really get to the complexity of the problem, and they kind of willfully say there isn't a complexity to the problem. The problem is simple, it's technology.
Well, they also do this thing like in the case of, well, let me frame, let me do that. This is what I think is the frame for why we're talking about Jonathan Haidt's book. Um, as we study,
Maybe we should set it up as
yeah,
a couple of things.
yeah,
We've been meaning to talk about Jean Twenge's work on millennials and Gen Z for a long time.
correct.
And I confess that every time I sit down to start reading Twenge's books, I'm like, this would be better in a conversation. Can I just get her on the phone? Can we just have a talk about this? But
Yeah,
also, her name keeps popping up in other conversations we have. Obviously, like when we talked to Kim Parker about Pew Research's decision to move away from the generational analysis, one of the things that they did was consult Jean Twenge, right? So clearly her work is incredibly influential and we have to reckon with it. So I just have to buckle down and finish reading one of these books instead of starting to read these books and not finishing it, partly because of my ADHD, partly because I want to have an argument with her as much as I want
I
to.
know.
Well, I don't even really want to have an argument with her. I want to like press in on, what does this mean? What do you mean when you say individualism and collectivism? Because I don't think I agree with the things you're calling individualistic and the things you're calling collectivist.
Totally.
Like, I think I would put them in completely opposite boxes. Why is that? Why would I put them in a completely different box than you?
Yeah.
And I think I have the same thing with Jonathan Haidt, who is now out with a new book. And the new book, I can't even remember what the name of the new book is. What is the
The
name of the new
anxious
book?
generation: how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness.
There you go. There you go. And this
So
comes after The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. And so I feel like, yet another person who is functionally writing about millennials and Gen Z. I will once again go back to my villain origin story or hero origin story, which is like, what was going on in your life at the time that you wrote your book, right? So Coddling of the American Mind is, he's a college professor. um, and, The Righteous Mind seems to be born out of living, like working in Charlottesville, and this is according to the New York Times piece, like working in Charlottesville, being out walking his dog, trying to figure out why the Democrats were not really taking Republicans to task for the war in Iraq. And because he had done his like doctoral research or his, academic research on the origins of morality, that's where the righteous mind came from. It was this like, we have, again, I just feel like uh, this shouldn't be new, but I guess to certain people in business, it was new, which is the idea that like there isn't like a concrete difference between rational thought and emotional response. And like, I don't know. I feel like if you took an intro to psych class in college, you probably should have picked that piece up, if nothing else. That like, I mean, I used to, in ad agencies and in market research, I used to see these charts that would have like diagrams of the human body, and it would be like rational, emotional, and I would have to like go, I'm sorry, I'm going to be the pedant. You guys are aware, right, that emotions aren't generated by the organ, the heart. You know that they all come from up here with feedback from other systems,
Yeah,
right? And they were like,
you're gonna need to
ooh.
zoom in, and then zoom back out, and then zoom in, and then zoom back out for this to be
Yeah,
accurate.
because it's just like in those conversations, I felt like you are applying this like medieval poetic structure to understanding how people process things in the world. And I know you think it's useful, but I don't think it is. I think it
Yeah.
makes you think that there are hard differences between things when there aren't. And so like this this New York Times piece starts with this like anecdote about when James Comey came to run the FBI, he made everybody read
No,
3 books and one of them was The Righteous Mind, and it was just like mind blown. People sometimes make decisions emotionally.
I know. So
And
this is
the shade I want to throw here is at James Comey, not only for
100%.
this,
Yeah,
but we'll
yeah,
go ahead and add it to the pile.
yeah. We don't have to look at his total body of work, but the the, the frame for me that was attractive about, I think we started talking about this last week on our call, this book, because Haidt has been making the rounds, and this is the problem. I don't actually care about the content of his book, but we are going to talk about it and go into a little bit of the flaws in the methodology. If we make the Anxious Generation book a proxy for Millennials Rising, you could see how one author with some credentials, his credentials are great, becomes the voice of a movement and begins to
Mhm.
seed ideas that some people critically challenge them. I think Farah might on this episode, but some people pick them up. Like he was on he was written about in the Atlantic and the Times, and he was on Hard Fork podcast, and like those people did. I know you have a hard time with the Hard Fork with Casey Newton. He's a lot, but
I
they
just
did
there are a lot.
interrogate.
I have to
Yeah,
spread out the frequency
they
with which I
did
listen to hard work.
interrogate him and
Good.
challenge the research. I don't find them to be like matadors,
No.
but
No. Bad people.
he still got to be on that platform and deliver his message. And there's some audience that would be like, oh, then that's true. Or like maybe I don't agree with point C or D, but thematically, I guess I agree with the idea
Yeah.
that, and by the way, his thesis is mobile devices and especially social media are causing mental illness among teens. And wow, that's
Yeah.
quite a claim to make. And like, yeah, I could see there's a lot of correlation. But again, another thing that we learn in Psych 101 is correlation and causation are two different things. And I'm not sure in nerd internet that nobody reads, unfortunately, they're all like, excuse me, we're the meek here speaking up, and we just want to point out that those two graphs look similar, but they're not related. And
Right. Yeah. I
you
mean,
can't just make up the story and that connects them.
exactly. There was that piece in Nature that I shared with you yesterday that we decided like maybe this can be kind of a starting point. And the money line from it is basically avoid making up stories by simply looking at trend lines. Like this is I think why I get like frustrated and would be the pestery kid in their class asking, like hand raised permanently because I have more questions.
Yeah, you would be holding your arm up because it's
I
so
Yes,
tired.
I would. Oh my God, I remember doing this.
I know that. I knew you would be the person that would be doing that.
I'm kind of I'm like embarrassed about
You
that.
blushing. I had you pegged as an arm holder. Like my point is going to get out no matter what happens. If the
Yes,
bell rings and you're still in your seat with your arm up.
exactly. And now what I do is like write notes and draw in the New York Times and like yes. So yeah, I can't help myself. I am such a
Notes
such a
on
sloppy
the
thinker.
physical newspaper is about as pointless as it gets. But I salute you.
Well, I get to like highlight things really easily, and then I can like see them again really easily. So yes, like there's a huge correlation causation problem in all of this work. I think there is also like, like I said, coddling of the American mind, righteous mind is like the Iraq war is going on. Democrats aren't doing a good job of standing up to Republicans. How come they're not? And saying like, well, I've decided that there are these like equivalents of taste buds in the brain that are the way we form morals, and Republicans use all six taste buds and Democrats only use three. And I'm like, okay, like you could take, I mean, when I was recommended The Righteous Mind, I had been on a jag of reading George Lakoff's stuff, which like the most famous one is Don't Think of an Elephant.
Oh, right,
Um,
right.
and he also has this kind of theory about you basically have in most societies, but in American society or Western societies, probably chiefly, you have kind of his framework for it is uh, strict father and nurturant parent, and like strict father ideologies are like hierarchy, obedience, and like deference to authority, obedience will somehow magically transform itself into self-reliance, um, which the psychological literature says it doesn't work like that. Like independence leads to self-reliance. Like being able to make your own decisions leads to self-reliance. Learning and failing leads to self-reliance. Doing what you're told does not, in fact, lead to self-reliance. It leads to dependence. Um, but okay. Nevertheless, we have a long tradition about that. Children should be seen and not heard. Spare the rod, spoil the child. All of that stuff is strict
Yes.
stuff, right? Then you've got nurturant parent. And nurturant parent is like, you should listen to your children. You should let them explore and play. You should let them discover for themselves who they are. You shouldn't, you should be there to support them, but like you're teaching them and providing them with tools so that they might discover how they want to be in the world. And then like turns out nurturant parent gets you self-reliant kids, right? Or self-reliant adults eventually. But these two psychological explanations basically say more people who identify as Democrats or liberals are part of the nurturant parent tradition, and more people who identify as conservatives or Republicans tend to be from the strict father tradition. So I was reading that stuff, and someone was like, "Oh, well, you've got to read The Righteous Mind." And I sort of skimmed it and was like, it's just a slightly more complicated version of what Lakoff is saying, right? Which is like the things that Democrats were missing were basically like authority and loyalty, and I can't remember what the other one was. Like there were sanctity was the sixth one, and like first of all, there are a lot of religious Democrats, and there are also a lot of small L liberals who regard democracy in the framework of sanctity,
Right.
like that is a sacred project. So like it's all a little facile. So anyway, he's reacting to the Iraq war, then he's reacting to be a college professor and having like mouthy kids in class going, you can't say that. And then he has teenagers now. And so he's really worried about the teens. And like I get it, man.
Yeah.
Like that all makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
But
But
you have to
I
impose
also have
a
teenagers, and that doesn't make me qualified to write a thesis that's like, I think social media is making them rotten kids, like making them mentally ill.
True. Now,
I don't have
he's
proof
got
of
a
that.
PhD in social psychology, so
I do
he
not,
does
by the
have,
way.
yes. So that would be a distinction. Neither do I.
Yeah.
Just sitting over here with my Juris Doctor that is not that useful.
I feel like I do use my bachelor's degree, yeah, of science.
I think that's actually the big joke is like you get to be like approaching 40 and you start to realize that your undergraduate or graduate education actually is useful.
Yeah.
But like there's a whole long 15, 20-year period there where you're like, I don't even know why you have to go to college because you don't use it
I
in the
know.
real world.
It's
And it's like,
actually a
oh, here
problem
it
because
is.
that idea influences people that are making the decision to go to college, and you're like,
I
"I
know.
don't know, I don't use it." And you're like, "Oh, no, actually, I'm drawing on it, like, constantly." It's just so well enmeshed in my thinking that I don't realize it.
Exactly. Yes. So
Mm.
so I think we just like have to acknowledge that. I think the other thing that was really interesting to me reading the New York Times profile of Haidt was regard him as one of these like, like there is a group of thinkers that I have heard Michael Hobbes and other people refer to as reactionary centrists. And I haven't really done any digging on like, is there like a real definition of what a reactionary centrist is? But there's a way that Haidt's work and his public speaking and that kind of thing fits in what I think of as reactionary centrism, which is like left right is inadequate to our times and needs. And so some kind of centrist approach where I go on Bari Weiss's podcast
Right.
and I also go on whatever Hard Fork or something or Pod Save the World or whatever. Not Pod Save the World, probably what's that weekend one? Offline, like goes on offline with John Favreau, something like that.
Mhm.
And like that's how I'll navigate the world, right down the center of these factions, but still being reactionary, still being like the kids are not all right, like things are bad, and like there is a whole universe of this, and apparently there's like a New York community of these people that's like hosted by the guy who runs the Reason Foundation, which publishes Reason magazine, and they literally have like tennis Sundays together and
Of course.
it feels all a little like this is like old school Republican stuff, but in like the 80s and early 90s, there was this like I can't remember which morning it was, but it was like the Wednesday morning meetup essentially of various right-wing interest groups that like Phyllis Schlafly would convene them for breakfast on a Wednesday morning or a Thursday morning. I can't remember what morning it was, but every week they would get together and just like share war stories, talk about what they were working on, see how they could collaborate, blah, blah, blah. And like this was the underpinning of what became known as like the vast right-wing conspiracy.
Mhm.
And it was, sort of a conspiracy. It was sort of in broad daylight, but like, yeah, they got together and talked about how they could help each other. There clearly is some sort of centrist public intellectual conspiracy like cabal, whatever. They like to get together on Sundays and play tennis
Yeah,
and and write books
it
that
will
are
be
bestsellers.
pickleball soon. The cynic in me says that centrist part is the most insidious part because who can refute the idea that the children are not all right, or who can say, oh, it's not, it's dangerous to say the kids aren't okay. And
Yeah.
to be centrist means you get more platform. You can go on things that are a little bit, anything within 40% of the center, you can go on and
Hmm.
and have a voice. You can write there, you can speak there, you can be invited to those events. And so an idea like this takes hold, and that can be dangerous when a person with a PhD is making assertions
Hmm.
that don't, the rest of the scientific community that is kind of neutral to the thesis is like, I don't know if that's true. They're
Right.
not, they're saying essentially like, I don't agree with the finding. They're not saying he's a bad guy, he's all totally wrong. They're just saying like the data is not there to support the most extreme parts of these claims. And your point earlier that like it all boils down to this one thing is a really dangerous idea in a world
Yeah,
where everything is so orchestrated invisibly in our lives.
I think that's right. And I also, I'm also extremely sympathetic to the feeling that like the widespread availability of internet connected mobile devices is a major turning point in just day to day interactions with other humans. we've talked about this before, but like I think a lot when I look at like my niece and nephew and the teens and preteens that I encounter through my my friends' kids and that sort of thing. They are living in a the phrase I like to use for this is like when I was a teenager, I could go to my room and be alone with my thoughts and my music
Yeah.
and my books, and Rolling Stone magazine because my mom's friend Janet gave me a subscription to Rolling Stone magazine when I was 15,
That's
and
pretty cool.
it was pretty cool. Also, we were renting a house and it had pink fluffy cloud wallpaper in my bedroom.
Oh,
It came that way. We did not do this because I would not do that. Um, and I used the cover of Rolling Stone magazine to wallpaper over the wallpaper.
it took a long time to get there, though.
Yeah, I never got there. We didn't stay in that house long enough for me to get there. But I did I got to obliterate a fair amount of it. It was not that big of a room. Um, and and that experience of alone with your thoughts or just like you're waiting at the bus stop before school and where I lived, like there were only like two other kids at that particular stop most mornings because other people got a ride. And so you didn't really know each other. You weren't in the same grade. You might chat a little, like, hey, sup, that kind of thing. And then you just sort of stand there. And like, if you've got a Walkman, you listen to your Walkman. And if you don't, you just sort of stand there.
Yeah.
And like thoughts float through your head. Or in the case of most teenagers, not really, not a lot of thoughts. Like waves of feelings maybe and
Yeah.
then like when's the bus coming, but
Right.
like that experience now those spaces in time are filled because you go to the phone, you go to like the phone is just it's always in your hand, it's always on
Yeah.
your body, you're always checking it. um like I even have reached a point now where I annoy myself for being unable to watch a television program without also having my iPad in front of me. I annoy my husband annoys me because he'll be sitting right there making noises like he is listening to the words that I am saying, but he is looking at a YouTube video about Fortnite and he is not really listening
I
for him.
am
Like
mega guilty of that.
information is filtering into his brain.
Yeah.
He's better than my dad. He can play back what I said,
Yeah.
but he wasn't listening. He wasn't in a conversation with
I'm
me.
getting 18% of the words.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. It's probably good
Not,
enough to get the gist a lot of the
not,
time.
it's not great.
It's not great, no. But I think, like, so I share the frustration. I share the feeling that, like, I feel like I had more ability to sit and read, to write, to be creative, um, all of those things before I had a smartphone.
But Farah,
But I
would
also was
you,
a teenager and I'm not anymore. So that's also a thing.
so based on that anecdotal experience, would you write a book that asserts that creativity of teenagers has been destroyed by cell phones?
No, but you've just written the pitch for me. This is how I'm gonna finally get that book published. I'm gonna get
We
an
could
agent off the back of
sell
that
the
idea.
absolute fuck out of that book.
Yes, we could.
Like, we would have an easier time selling that book than our millennials book.
I think that's right. Maybe that's what we should do instead. Um,
I mean, I feel like every episode we could crank out a book pitch. We could have the AI scroll the transcript and be like, the book pitch is
oh, let's
the
just do that.
sellable.
I've got a ChatGPT account. We can just do it. Um, yeah, I mean, so I am sympathetic, right? I want to just like I don't think it's great. Like I don't think it has been. I don't think there is some evidence that like um that for young girls in particular, um, the kind of body dysmorphia, eating disorders, sexualization, online harassment, all of that is really bad. Um, and it is enabled and amplified and algorithmically forced onto them and everything else through this technology. But it's not the only stuff that's going on. Again, like that nature piece talked about how like you can't just say that because on average the economy is better than it's ever been and that fewer people are in poverty than ever before, that when shocks to the political and economic and social system occur, they don't still disproportionately affect the bottom 20 percentile of American households in terms of income. And unfortunately, one of the things that the United States has that I think, like, as I was reading that Nature piece, I was like, that's compelling. Let's like someone investigate that. Is 1 in 6 children are in poverty in the United States. That's a lot of kids that are in poverty. So I think, there is a certain kind of things are just really difficult. And the disparity between people who have it hard and people who don't is so great and so evident and constantly broadcast right at you,
Right.
because every time you open your phone, there it is. And then I think the other thing is a lot of this data that both of them rely on is self-reported survey data. Now, both of them will go to great lengths to tell you, oh, but then we looked at
Right.
CDC data about suicidality and like attempted suicides and like or self-harm or whatever. And those things are not self-report. Those are reported by health officials. Fine. But like the fact of increased attempted suicides or successful suicides, and also, I shouldn't say successful suicides. It's a terrible way to phrase it, but completed. I don't know what the word is. Appears to more or less correlate with rising levels of self-reported depression, anxiety, etc. Um, is also not like there's a causation causality or sorry correlation causality problem there. There's also like there was a chart in Generations by Jean Twenge where it was like looking at depression rates, and it was like girls were much more depressed than boys,
Right.
and then they looked at suicide rates, and I was like, but they looked at it in a different way. It wasn't a trend line. It was like a bar chart. And I was like, I'd like to see both of those data sets
On the same scale and
on the
presented in
same
the same way.
scale
Yeah.
in the same way. Exactly. And like this is just one of the things that I feel like if you start from the perspective that, well, okay, and both of them do. And the reason that we keep talking about Twenge and Haidt in tandem, I think, is in part because you listened to the hard fork episode. I did not. And Haidt invoked Jean Twenge as somebody who agrees with him about this
And
stuff.
she's a collaborator on some of the research for the work. So in some of the so what he's
Yeah.
done this time is he's produced a website where some of the he says it's somewhat exhaustive. The research that he used and did is posted, so you can go in and read that research. And so she, along with what's his name, Zach Roush, who's also from NYU, are listed on some of those studies, not all of them. But
Hmm.
in that interview I heard, he says like there's a lot of people on the other side of this conversation, but I am aligned with Jean Twenge, and I was like, of course you are. Like you didn't have to
Yeah.
tell me that.
Yeah. And because they both agree that the problem is the tech. And like this is the thing that matters most. And I think like again the kind of going back to one of the things I highlighted in the New York Times piece was so he talks about he examined data on Gen Z mental health and found a tidal wave of anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. Major depressive episodes have roughly doubled for teenagers since 2010, according to his research. Now, so one of the things I want to acknowledge here as well is some of the major depressive episodes things, that data, as I understand it, some of it comes from kids being actually hospitalized for major emotional
Right.
events, right? That is also a change in culture. So parents bothering to take their children to seek healthcare support for those moments
Yeah.
is newish in culture.
Yeah.
Here's a second part of it. The Affordable Care Act required mental health coverage. And
Right.
so the thing you used to have to do if your child was having major anxiety or depression is somehow come up with the money to put them in a mental institution,
Correct.
which you didn't want to put them in an institution and you didn't have the money to do it anyway.
And the third thing is the stigmas around even talking about this stuff have
Yes.
faded away, so that you can't compare. Do you know what the conversation would be in 1980? In anecdote, in 1990, what year was it? 8. I was out of school. I had my first, like, my own doctor, my own health insurance, and I went to the doctor, Dr. Harry Stanger, fantastic doctor in Boston. He retired. He actually quit medicine because he didn't like the insurance companies. He, I went to him and I said, "Hey, I'm having these feelings. I don't know what to do with them. I feel like depressed." And he was like, "I don't want to write that down in your chart. I want you to steep in that for a little bit and come back to me, because if once I write that down, it's going to follow you around." That was the answer. And I love this guy. But at that time,
Yeah.
that was the treatment for it. And now
Mhm.
it's like, go, I defy you to go on TikTok and scroll 3 videos without hearing someone talk about how they're divergent or they're depressed or they
Yeah.
have some, and God bless it. Like, I think that's a net positive, but you can't look at a study without some serious controls to look at self reports, as you pointed out already, but
Mhm.
also just the acceptance in the culture that people go through these
Yes.
things. It is okay to talk about it. We need help when we need help. Um, and then the ACA is a huge part of that, that, like, oh, there is coverage for this thing. It must be real, versus
Yeah.
parents of yesteryear saying, like, it's in your head, just toughen up, you'll be fine.
Right. And, like we now have venture backed startups for providing telehealth, mental health support. Um, we do projects related to, you work in higher ed, we do projects related to higher ed. We hear a lot from prospective students in these kinds of institutions about wanting more mental health support.
Yes, we have a robust offering at ASU to make sure students are supported.
Yeah. And like we're just in a different cultural moment where we talk about these things more. So I think there's like, I don't know how you would statistically control for taboos,
Yeah.
but I think you kind of have to at least take it into consideration. I mean, I even have, I have a relative who is about my age and is struggling with addiction, and his mother does not want to acknowledge that. Like, inside the household, we can acknowledge it, but don't go see a therapist. Don't go to rehab. Don't do that stuff. That would be bad for some reason. Like, the stigma is still real for her.
Yeah.
And, obviously the kind of the rest of the family is like, the world has moved on, get treatment. Um, but you can't dislodge her from that set of values. She has not evolved
Right.
with the rest of the culture. Um, I think the other thing that comes up with this, and it comes up in both of their work, is this, and Twenge talks about it in the context of like individualism versus collectivism.
Collectivism. Yeah, that's her big dichotomy.
And there's a lot of stuff in there that's like, I wish she'd just sort of come out and say which is her preference, because sometimes it seems like her preference is a little more collectivism would go a long way. The thing about that, I mean, there's a variety of things about that. One is, there's not a lot of evidence that collective societies are happier than individualistic societies. And that actually it's not about the collectivism or the individualism. It's about in-group, out-group biases and all of this other stuff. Like, and so you get more unhappiness, appear to get more unhappiness in collectivist societies because they are more culturally homogenous and do more in-group, out-group stuff.
Yes.
Individualist societies are more diverse. So the in-group, out-group stuff has to be reckoned with in a different way. If you live in a pluralistic democracy like we do, then like
Today.
collectivism's really hard in that finite definition, really hard to manage, because we're not all the same, but we all need to be equal under the law. And like, she also has some ideas in there that like civil rights movements are inherently individualistic, and I'm like, that would be news to the people in those movements who are in solidarity with each other and with other movements. Like, this is very weird
And
stuff.
where they are trying to get is to the collective.
Yes.
Those movements are saying, like, we are currently outside the collective and we want just the same as what they have, the
Yes.
same esteem, the same rights. Like,
Yes.
so when you look at, I keep throwing this back to Millennials Rising, because those authors of Millennials Rising at that time had a life experience and had a point of view that they made pretty plainly in that book and The Fourth Turning and their other writing. And I think what's happening now is authors like these are doing a similar thing, but they have a different set of platforms with which to sell in the ideas.
Yeah.
And like that individualism versus collectivism got in 2012, 20, I'm reading IGN right now. Maybe it was 2015, got sold in as like millennials are quirky and they want things their own way. And that got so easily consumed. Like that's pretty dangerous
Hmm.
because I have no idea if that's true. But then the as we've talked about, like Sherm took that to be like when you're managing millennials or hiring them, they need to feel like beautiful snowflakes, and that turned into a narrative too. And
Yes.
so I'm going through the research that Haidt has posted on his website here, and in one that's called Social Media and Mental Health, which he credits Twenge and Zach Roush. After what's it's not quite traditional research, so but or up at the top, there's a disclosure that says we are not unbiased. Haidt came to the tentative conclusion that there is a causal link and said so in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Twenge said the same thing in her book, iGen. Haidt's own research, presented in The Righteous Mind, says we are likely to be motivated to find evidence to support the positions we took publicly. So he wrote a book about how confirmation bias happens. He is the famous elephant rider example. Like all people, we suffer from confirmation bias, but we take J.S. Mill seriously. We know we need help from critics. So they invite critics to add to the research. It's not clear how much that's happened, but or how much it's been considered. There is research listed here, but so it, the thing is, who else besides you and I, although there are 4 other people in this Google Doc right now, which is kind of hilarious, um, who
That's great. I love it.
reads this and said, most of the people reading the New York Times, the Sunday Times, and read this op-ed or read this thing, a reaction to it, don't go in and do the nerd thing that you and I do and put sticky notes on these pieces of research and say like, oh, but what about this? Oh, these charts don't make sense, or like I would love to go deeper and see what the controls were here. And then it just gets what will happen next month is that these will be turned into 10 ways to get your kids off of TikTok. And it's like, is that a net
Yeah.
bad? No, but is it right? Does it solve the actual problem? It sure doesn't.
It's an interesting thing. Like I remember same woman who gave me the Rolling Stone subscription at some point, and they would have been in their 40s when this happened. But at some point, her husband was diagnosed as obsessive compulsive, having obsessive compulsive disorder, and and she talked about the experience of thinking, well, now we have a name for it. It can be handled. It can go away. And it's like, not how that works. Now you have a name for it. You have to learn how to live with it.
Right.
You have to learn like where you can mitigate it, which strategies, medications, et cetera, might help mitigate it. He's got to want to not have those behaviors in order to take any kind of medication that might mitigate them,
Yes.
which he super didn't.
No. So he's like,
Um,
we are biased. The end.
yeah, right. And and I think there is this like give it a name. It's the cell phones. Okay, great. Taking the cell phones away. So my kids will be happier, right? And it's, one of the problems I think of kids in general is that you are not raising them out in the middle of nowhere on your 40 acres, distinct from all other people. They don't get to see you. Like that was the other great thing I loved at the beginning of the very first anecdote in Generations. If I can go back to the very beginning of this book is in the Bay of Bengal. There is an
They always
island
start with these anecdotes.
called North Sentinel. And the people who live there not only don't want to leave, they don't want anyone coming here. And now like the government of India has said like, you can't go there. And I'm like, I feel like you're romanticizing this, like, this murderous group of people living on an island who refuse to interact with anyone else. That's the way to be. Like, it's just a little weird.
This feels like
Um,
my elderly man corner. Like that sounds like a dream to me.
yeah.
Nobody's coming. Great. During football season, it's amazing.
But I think like most kids just aren't raised in that kind of environment. So if you're going to take away your kids' phones, are all of their friends' parents going to take away their phones? Now, I understand this is why Hyatt's policy prescription is schools should ban phones, and then no one has phones. Um, Now, setting aside that in an era where parents are rightly, though also disproportionately, worried about school shootings, the idea of sending your kids to school without a way for them to call you or call
Yes.
911
Yes.
is, I would imagine, like, no, that
Terrifying.
would just be a hard no.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, like, the backlash would not be from kids, it would be from parents who
100%.
say, "No, I need to be able to find my kids.
Hmm.
They need to be able to find me. They need to be able to call for help because I can't trust the school to do it, and I can't trust the local cops to do it if I'm in Uvalde, Texas." Like, there's just too much in the ether about that to say, "I'm taking the phones away."
And that's one example, like one top of mind. Hey, here's a story that the research that his narrative leaves out, which is, oh, the kids are using social media more. Kids are also having more anxiety and mental health disorders. Therefore,
Mhm.
let's get rid of the phones. It's like, yes, as long as they all have the same makeup of their household, they live in the same quality of housing, they live in the same type of neighborhood, they go to the
Mhm.
same level of school or type of school or have access to school and learning materials that are the same and teachers that are trained in the same way, they have the same public access
Yep.
to resources and help and support, and they have neighbors who care about them or don't. Like,
Yep.
I'm not
This
advocating
is
for one over the other, but you have to control for all those other myriad things before
yeah.
you can decide which that cell phones will solve it.
That also is a really good point, and I think that we all should have learned about the pandemic and the problem of doing school from home is not everybody had broadband internet in their homes. Not
Totally.
everyone had laptops. And most of the remote learning software really doesn't work on a mobile device.
Hmm.
And it really doesn't work over a cell phone connection, a wireless data plan. So you have parents driving their kids to the parking lot of McDonald's because McDonald's has free Wi-Fi, and they're sitting in the parking lot of McDonald's doing homework. You have school districts that are trying to get Chromebooks to send home with kids because they don't have computers at home and so can't
Right.
get on to Canvas or whatever they're using in order to do their assignments.
Yep.
They can't get on Zoom. Like, all of those kinds of things are extremely real. And so now you're going to take away the internet connected the internet connected computer in their pockets that is affordable because you can do it on a month to month plan, and or you can get it free with your service plan. Like, this was always one of the we talk about this all the time when I was at Holland Partners and OTX, was like the digital divide did not play out the way we expected it to, right? It wasn't going to be poor people don't have access to the internet and rich people do. It was going to be rich people are going to have a phone and a tablet and a laptop and a gaming PC and a console, and poor people are going to have a smartphone. So everybody's got a smartphone, but for some people that's all they've got. That
Right.
is it's an expensive phone and a cheap computer.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's why you get the smartphone.
And it's a great
But
way to
it's not good
connect,
enough
but it's,
for all the
yeah,
things that we need it to do.
no,
And it
even I don't have all, I only have this and a laptop, but there's things on the phone I simply will not try to address. Like, I will
no,
not schedule meetings on my phone. It's like, I'm not, it just doesn't work the way I want it to. I don't
no.
understand all the context of the buttons I'm pushing. It always goes cattywampus. I have to do that on a laptop.
Yeah, but, so I think, like, these are just 2 examples, right? Like, you can't take away the phone because that's their computer and they need a computer for school. You can't take away the phone because what if there's an emergency and you need to call 911 or call your parents or whatever? Um, and then there's the, like, I think it's very funny. One of his partners in Let Grow, his nonprofit, became famous because she got in trouble for letting her kid take the bus home or something in New York City at like 9 years old. You find your way home from
Oh,
Manhattan,
I've read that. Yeah.
um, and like. I kind of remember this story happening because I think around the time of that story, some friends of mine in DC, I think they live technically in like Arlington or something, but they or Alexandria maybe. They had started doing the same thing where like they'd go to um the Saturday market in DC and let their like 10 or 11-year-old bring their 5-year-old home on the bus. And like if memory serves, like they gave the older one a phone because then they could track her. Like they could see where they were. But they let them do that because what if, God forbid, something happened and they got separated? The kids do need to know how to get home from
Right.
places. And and this used to be fairly normal, like walking a mile to school. Like I remember, I remember my mother being exercised because we were like right at the furthest edge of like just after us was where the bus coverage started. But like technically, we weren't on the bus route. So either I would have to walk a whole long way to get to the bus route to take the bus to school, or I'd have to walk. And the only reason that this was a hardship is that I was in the band and I had an alto saxophone. And this is like before rolly luggage that was all just like integrated. Like now I think they just have rolling saxophone cases. But like this was a heavy thing to carry on top of the backpack or whatever else. And so my mom drove me to school a lot until she figured out you could buy those like collapsible luggage rollers
Yeah.
before everyone started putting rollers in the luggage.
Right.
And so she got me those and some bungee cords. And so like I'd bungee up my saxophone onto the roller and roll it to school every day. But nevertheless,
It
it was like a 30-minute walk
it
for me to
enabled
go to
you to
school.
walk to school, but it crippled your pride.
Yes, that is exactly correct. 100%. 100% did that. Um, but like, like that used to be kind of par for the course. And now every school, it's like the school run is now something every parent is doing. Like, and some of me is just like, just take the freaking bus. I mean, just take the freaking bus.
Yeah.
But, I think it's interesting that like that idea of like we should let our kids be more independent, but we're also living in an age of adult anxiety about shooters, disasters, terrorism, just infrastructure failures, like just basics of like, okay, you wanted to take the bus, but the bus broke down. Now what do you do? Like, does your kid know how to adjust when um I don't know. The thing that's coming to mind right now is I was an adult, very much an adult at this point in time, but I had gone to Seattle for business and decided to go down to Portland to see my mom. And my solution was I was just going to take the train, just going to take the Pacific Northwest Starlight. And it broke down just outside of Tacoma.
Oh,
And the next one coming behind us was also having a technical failure. And so basically, there was not going to be another train for several hours. The drive from Seattle to Portland is 5.5, 6 hours max, if you're doing the speed limit. And so my solution was call a cab company, get them to take me to SeaTac, rent a car, and drive to Portland. Right. But that was like a grown up who travels for a living
right,
solution. Everyone else was just like beside themselves trying to figure out how they were going to get where they were trying to go. And these were all adults.
right.
Imagine you're a kid on the train. Like I take the train into the city all the time. I can't remember which stop it's at, but there is a stop where all of a sudden all these kids who go to a private school or at least a school that requires uniforms all get on the train. And 2 stops later, they all get out. And I'm like, and so what happens if there's a train breakdown, a derailment? Do they know how to get either home or to school
Right.
from the middle stop?
Right.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And it's like this also goes back to I don't know. I feel like I'm meandering here, but it goes back to my problem with the coddling of the American mind. Because who's doing the coddling? They're not coddling their own minds. And yet all the criticism is aimed at the students. It's aimed at the young people in the classrooms arguing with the professor because he said something politically incorrect. That is the where the criticism is pointed, even though, and this goes back to, I guess, the nurturant parent thing. We're like, well, let's talk about it. Does it make you feel uncomfortable? Should you understand what that phrase really means
Yeah.
when you hear it? Or should I just try to shield you from it and like I won't explain how that's actually a really racist thing to say or whatever? Like, we'll just let it slide. The coddling is probably very well intentioned. And then I think there is sort of this hard fork that people have to make where it's like, I now have to live in a world where not everyone cares about my feelings the way my parents and, teachers growing up cared about my feelings. I also think the other thing about all of this stuff is it wildly privileges the experience of upper middle class, mostly white kids.
Yeah.
And so, as ever, we continue to just ignore everybody else. In Generations, most of Twengi's anecdotes where she goes and interviews someone from each of the generations, they're all college educated. Silent generation black guy, college educated. And it's like, wow, do you know how rare he actually is in
Right.
his generation and with the rest of his demographic makeup? So it's just, I think the frustration I have with all of these things is always going to be, I agree with you that is a problem. I just don't think it's the whole problem. And I don't think your solution is adequate to the problem. And there are so many easy, obvious reasons why it'll never work.
Yes. And I agree that studying it is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that writing about it is valuable. You can't start with, here's the answer. Now there's 420 pages that support this.
420, you say?
Yeah. I don't know how many pages the book is, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. The other thing that stood out to me in both Twengi and what I have read, because obviously I have not yet read this book from Haidt since it's just out, but the idea that, and the line from the New York Times piece is, he argues that young people historically drew a deep sense of purpose when facing thorny challenges.
Prove it.
Whether World War II or the movement against the war in Vietnam. Now, that's just not true. Like, it's first of all, it's just not true. A deep sense of purpose. Some people did. Some people
were just drafted into World War II.
Yeah.
Their experience was like, Uncle Sam told me I have to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And the idea that like there was a mass solidarity movement against the Vietnam War is just historically untrue. Most baby boomers who were college kids at the time or were of college age at the time were in favor of the war. It was a minority of boomers who were against the war.
Yeah, there were more protests than was usual for the United States.
Yes.
But it was still a minority of people. Yeah.
Yeah. But the other part of it is those, like we talked about before, those things are concrete challenges. They're wars. Wars are things that have beginnings and ends, hopefully. And not so much lately with Russia, but eventually it will come to an end, either because one side or the other will run out of people and stuff to use in fighting each other, which is the grim reality of war. But there's always like a way that this comes to an end. You run out of money, you run out of munitions, or you run out of people to fight. Those are the things that happen. And
run out of semiconductors is the new one.
Yeah, run out of drone parts. The difference is, that the critics of this thinking are like, well, of course they're more depressed and anxious. They're living in an era of natural disasters, climate change, school shootings, threats to democracy, misinformation, disinformation, all the terrible harassment that happens online, like, seeing family, COVID, like all of these things that, and Twengi talks about this too, that like, we should have seen more solidarity amongst millennials during COVID. And I'm like, it's very difficult to do solidarity when the solution, or at least one of the solutions to a problem, is social isolation. Yeah. So like, and also, like, show me the evidence they didn't. Like, show me the evidence that it was millennials who disproportionately refused to wear masks and get vaccines. Because I don't think that's actually what the data show. I think what the data show is it was like older Gen Xers and younger boomers who were like, I'm not masking, I'm not getting a vaccine. But like, again, if I'm wrong, someone please tell me. But like, again, show me the evidence that that's the case. The other thing about it, though, is just that like a global pandemic, climate change, these like stochastic events of like school shootings and terrorist attacks and whatever, like they just are not these clear, there is a good guy and a bad guy and I know which side I'm on kind of fights. It's fighting water. And it's just like, so you are looking for a reason to say these people aren't the way I want them to be, and not really looking at their context ever. And I think, this one of the pages I started shouting at in Generations had to do with basically talking about there there was this amazing little little passage about like Regency England, and that like men like everyone, that this was a time of collectivism because everyone, like her definition of collectivism is basically like your group identity is more important than your individual identity, and under individualism your individual identity is more important than your group identity, which is weird again to then say that civil rights movements, which are about your group identity, are individualistic movements. But anyway, like this argument is like, well, in Jane Austen era England, people knew that they might have to, sacrifice themselves if they were called to war. And I'm like, yeah, because it was a king, and the king was going to make you go to war. And if you didn't go to war, if you didn't go saddle up to fight France, then they were going to throw you in jail, possibly hang you for treason, and take all your land. Like your family would be destitute. So, yeah. And also like the rich gentry ones, like they got to pay a servant to go serve, to go serve on their behalf. And the other part of that is like, that wasn't a like sense of self-sacrifice for a lot of these people. These were the not firstborns.
Right.
These were the ones who needed a commission so that they could get land, because that was
Right.
frequently the reward for serving in the king's army.
And
Like
surviving.
this isn't just about like common collective cause. There is a system. It's called a monarchy.
Right.
It's called feudalism. And like if you have that system, then yes, it calls you to collective action in a different way than a pluralistic democracy with a volunteer army does. You're absolutely right. But are we talking about technology then? Is this the fault of smartphones? Like no. And is it like some sort of inherently individualistic society, blah, blah, blah problem? That's part one. Part two is like her stretching of technology as the cause of problems takes a very weird turn very early on when she's talking about what she means by technology. So I was prepared for her to be very kind of specific about the technologies in the same way that Haidt is like super focused on the smartphone and social media.
Yeah.
Like, would it just be like consumer technology, that kind of stuff? And in fairness to Twenge, she includes things like birth control and airplanes and whatever. But she also says like airplanes were involved in like 4 major crisis moments for each generation. And so it's like they were used to drop bombs in World War II. And then they were like, I can't remember what the second thing was, but the third and fourth thing was that they were also the way that AIDS and COVID-19 spread. And I was like, I mean, yeah.
I mean, people traveled.
Yeah. So like, what's the answer?
Do you think people blame planes for COVID?
I don't know, because they were also on cruise ships. Like,
But isn't
I
that
don't
the
know.
way the flu transmits, or the common cold, or like?
I mean, honestly, we were
Nuts.
spreading disease before we had airplanes. Like, I don't know. Like, sure, it happens faster. It happens faster. Sure, the acceleration of certain kinds of technologies, but it's just like it's so deterministic. I have started with the feeling that the thing that is defining
Yeah.
generations is technology and not cultural events or just like demographics. I need to now backfill my argument with evidence of that, and just about anything can be evidence for that. And that I think is the problem. Is like, okay, but you're ignoring systems. You're kind of looking at 2 trend lines next to each other and go, oh, these must be causing each other.
But there's
And I've
also
already
this,
decided that I think the problem's tech. And so let's go look
and,
at the tech trend lines.
and there's also, I think, in talking about thought leaders like these two, and we'll come back to this topic. It's like, oh, now we have to talk about Generation Alpha. And Generation Alpha starts necessarily at the day before, or ends at the day before Gen Z starts. And they go this far back because I said so, even though I don't know what the crisis or generational occurrence or technology change will be, because how the hell could I predict that? And so I can do
Mhm.
this because I need to write a book, or
Mhm.
because I need to continue my research, and I need to do it in a, now it has to be whatever it is based on the thought leader, specifically 12-year window, specifically 15 window. And I feel like the timeframes are getting shorter, because even though we talk about a longitudinal view of generations, we're really talking about individual contributors who are stretching as far as they can while still advancing their research and careers. So it's hard to say, like, if boomers is a 30-year generation, no one's going to be alive for three of those generations to carry that torch and publish. I think Jean Twenge's published, she's like dined out on this for 10 years with like 5 books.
Mhm.
And good on you. Like, get the money, get the bag.
Yeah,
Great.
get the bag.
But
Exactly.
like we're all now in this subscription model for like, well, when's the next generation going to drop? Like, holy moly.
Oh, we
Do
should
we
make a
need
meme
to be
for promoting the show. Wake up, honey, next
new
generation.
generation drop? Like, I can't wait for generation beta. Like,
Oh God, please don't let it be beta.
new
That
generations always drop on Tuesdays. Like, I just, I don't know.
I, I think this is a thing for us to continue to drill in on it. I think like one of the reasons that talking about generations matters is that what we're really doing when we do it, and these two are pretty explicit about this stuff, is they're making predictions about what the future is going to be like.
They don't want to be considered futurists. I think they see a line in the sand of like credibility
Yes.
in both, that the word futurist is a little fraught coming from a
Yes.
PhD position, but also when you make a prediction, people hold you to account sometimes if you have a high enough level of notoriety, which these two do. So they don't, I don't feel like they say like, here's what I think is going to come of this. I think they essentially say like, society is fraying, and if you are a traditional boomer, you should be scared of these young people because they want to do individualist things that don't benefit you.
Yeah. In Generations 20 is pretty overt about it. I mean, she even says at one point, although people continue to change throughout their lives, our fundamental views of the world are often shaped during adolescence and young adulthood, making the younger generations a crystal ball for what is to come. A crystal
Mm.
ball. She also says somewhere else that like actually when you look at when you look at this stuff, it's pretty easy to predict what the future is going to be like, and it's like
Really?
okay. Because she also says in the book, like, Howe and Strauss make these predictions about what the millennials are going to be like. And the thing they didn't see coming was smartphones. And so that's why they're wrong.
Right. That's what makes predicting the future hard.
Hmm.
It's like,
She
but for
also
me,
says
it's
that they
easy.
were extremely prescient by saying that, like, something big was going to happen around 2020. And I'm like, that is Nostradamus level stuff right
Right.
there. Like, something
Right.
big's going to happen like every
Right.
20 years. Yeah.
There's 8 billion people. Like, it's inevitable.
Something big happens every year.
I know. We just had the Oscar. You believe it?
Yes. I mean, people will be writing about the year of Barbenheimer for the rest of our lives.
I hate to tell you that that's probably true.
Yeah. Yeah, someone's gonna write that book. There's actually a book in my cart at the moment that is literally called 1995. And it's just about like this is the year the future began and like here are all the reasons why. And I'm just
Who wrote it?
fascinated. Like someone his name is W. Joseph Campbell, and the only reason I remember this is that it's not Joseph Campbell,
Right.
the
He's not
hero's
talking about the
journey.
hero's
Joseph
journey.
Campbell. Yeah, he's a journalism professor who's written also a book about polling errors in presidential campaigns, which is how
Oh
he
yeah,
came to be on my radar.
that's your wheelhouse right there, baby.
Yeah, I love me some polling errors.
Well, I think
Best.
we've done a good setup of this topic, but I may pause iGen so I could read Generations and catch up with you, and then maybe we'll do a kind of a book review of
May I
Generations.
propose a different approach, which is
Yeah,
that you read iGen and I read Generations, and we just sort of talk about
meet
like
in the middle.
where do they overlap? Where is there anything new happening in Generations versus in iGen? I feel like iGen really wants to focus on that one's the one about millennials, right? Yes.
It's
She's also
yeah.
written
This is
something
where
that's more
she's
Gen
like
Z
trying to
focused.
take
Yeah.
the mantle from Millennials Rising and be like, now here's the continuation of like.
Yes. And then I think just to be completist, we should set aside an episode dedicated to The Impatient Woman's Guide to Having Children or whatever the name of that book was.
I'm not reading that book, but yeah.
Neither am I.
I mean, is that unfair for me to say, like, listen, there's a line.
No, there's
I
a
would
line, and
rather
that's a
read a
perfectly
collection of Beetle Bailey comic strips.
yeah. Um, I just like as someone familiar with the genre, I just want to spare you from having to read about cervical mucus. So, which if it's not in there, I don't know if it's really a book about fertility or having kids. That's my take on the genre. Is if you're not talking about cervical mucus, I just don't know.
I am fine with this conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. My apologies.
It's good. Listeners like
which might be my new sign off. My apologies.
I can't tell you how many notes we get from listeners that are like, why no more cervical mucus conversations? Like, how come
It's
there's
true.
no more? We need more sweet cervical mucus content.
We could also get into a big like philosophical debate about what egg quality is.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, we
Mm-hmm.
should. We
No.
should.
No,
Maybe
I really
not.
think we shouldn't.
Okay.
I don't think
I'm good with that.
If we really want to get to the heart of this whole generational thing, it all starts with the egg.
Doesn't it?
That's the name of the
surprised
book.
I'm surprised nobody's like tried to get on that corner yet and be like, no, I'm going to go even younger.
So I actually will make a soft prediction, which is that given this new politicization of IVF, I think it's coming. I think a conversation about like the reason the kids today is because there are too many of them that were conceived with artificial reproductive technology.
Oh, it's definitely coming, and it's coming from Ben Shapiro. You know what else I think we should do? Speaking of brilliant minds, we should just start writing our Generation Gamma book. We should.
When will they be born?
Who gives a shit?
Okay, 2060.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. It doesn't make any sense, but it is 100% predictable in the model we're in, where like the cycle is now defined, and it's defined by book publishing times.
Well, I mean, you know what the
we
thing
could
to get
sell
on
that
now.
Book.
The thing to get on now is Generation Beta is defined by generative AI.
Oh yes. No, generative AI natives.
Yes. Oh, I've got a better name for them. Generation Agent.
Oh, I like this. Yeah, see, now you're thinking merchandising. Now you're talking.
The coffee just kicks in.
Yeah.
There is, I think, a whole section in the middle of this conversation that I'm going to have to cut because I lost my train of thought, but kept talking.
I thought it was good. I was tracking with you the whole way.
I'm so glad someone was.
I think we did it.
I'm not sure it was totally me. But yes, we're going to keep talking about Jane Twenge. We're going to keep talking about Jonathan Haidt. I think I might have to actually read this book.
I think we should both read that one, but let's agree to come back.
Let's finish our Twengies.
Yeah. How many times has that phrase been uttered? Children, finish your Twengies. Yeah, with the wagging finger, of course. All right. Great to see you as always.
Have a good one.
In the Demo is written and hosted by Farah Bostic and Adam Pierno, with support from the Difference Engine. Edited by Allison Preisinger and Amp Studio, with production support from Ashley Darrington. Music used with permission by Omega Man under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research, supporting information, and transcripts. If you'd like to support the show, please rate, review, and share the show with people you think will appreciate it. Thanks for listening.